Are you ready for the questions?
Yes. So you'll ask me and then I'll ask you?
Yes.
Great. Let's go.
Cool. Diana, what role do you think fellows play, especially those that are not in the fields of education or youth? What is the role that they play in the vision towards an everyone a changemaker world?
Fellows can contribute to everyone a changemaker in so many different ways. First of all, if they're not in the field, if they're not working with young people or with education, they have partners and partnerships that are relevant to our Collaborative Entrepreneurship Jujitsu strategies. They may know journalists, they may have media partners, they may have how-tos in their strategy that are relevant to the work that we're doing now, even if it's not in their field. And that's something we've learned in fellowship for years, that the most impactful collaborations tend to be how-tos that are new to a particular field, but old in another one. Yeah. So what's old in environment may be brand new in the field of education, and that's where we get the biggest pop. This word jujitsu, and each, can we give it a different name, which is easier to understand and also pronounce for non-native speakers?
The Jiu-Jitsu idea is basically, it's another way of talking about a leveraging effect. So a Jiu-Jitsu partner is a partner that helps us leverage because they're powerful, because they're in the big game, because they are connected to several constituents, because they can drive and change public conversation and things like that. And the use of Jiu-Jitsu is basically because it has to be very surgical, because we have limited resources and people and so on. So we need to apply the effort, most of our effort, in specific spots and positions and places and organizations that will have the most impact towards changing the framework. So that's where it comes from. I mean, we were struggling with the word as well, although there's this thing called Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, which is, you know, the Jiu-Jitsu variant in Brazil is very strong, and you see it in other parts of the world, these signs saying Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. So there's a fun thing as well. I think we learned to treat it more like a fun thing, and it's kind of, because it's kind of unusual, it helps also kind of break the ice when you're talking to people. So I think as long as people understand what it is and what's the criteria that is necessary to recognize a Jiu-Jitsu partner as such, I think that's the most important thing. And yes, and the rest is, of course, when we engage with them, we don't call them Jiu-Jitsu. I mean, we could, but we don't engage them that way. So it's important for us to understand that some of the Ashoka language is important for us to have a common strategy. And we should look at it that way, approach the language as a tool for us to be aligned. So it's not so much as if we agree or not with the exact term, but making sure we're aligned with the use of language.
New language helps people pay attention.
This is a really good question. Why, Diana, have we decided to do the Collaborative Entrepreneurship Jujitsu, ourselves, as opposed to relying on the fellows to be the leaders of this movement?
Fellows are certainly co-leaders in this movement. We have the bird's eye view. We can see how each and every Ashoka Fellow's intervention fits into a broader whole of the problem that we're trying to address. And any one fellow is so focused on their own work and learning from others and taking ideas from everywhere. But it's Ashoka's role, it has been Ashoka's role for 40 years to find the how-tos that fit into a broader approach. This is something, this goes back to the 80s. I mean, we were talking about this and looking at this in the 80s, and the first measuring effectiveness surveys that we did, we found the fellows 10 years out say the biggest value of Ashoka was this very idea of how their individual intervention fits into a broader whole. That is our role, is to see the whole, to see the field, and we have colleagues all around the world who help us do that. And so having that visibility, seeing differently so we can do differently, is exactly the framework change work that we're doing.
So it's less about who is doing it and should or should not, but how and the role that each of our fellows partners play in each movement.
Exactly. What's a jiu-jitsu partner, and what are the 4 types?
So we have Well, first, what is a Jiu-Jitsu partner? Is a partner that is that has the power of shifting, directing, increasing, and even decreasing, if they do the bad thing, the social demand for an everyone a changemaker world. So by that we mean that they're the forces that help, for instance, parents make decisions about where their kids should study. Mm-hmm. They're the forces that help and influence schools to come up with a curriculum that should be enforced upon all of them. They're the forces that define the role and the public view of teachers in society. They're the ones that help tell the stories, the everyday stories that people consume to make sense of what's going on in the world. Mm-hmm. They're the ones that are writing and are producing knowledge and distributing knowledge that help inform people and then make their decisions. Mm-hmm. So I just described the five in that order are, governments, all levels of governments. Doesn't matter if you like them, you don't like them. That we cannot argue that they don't have a huge impact in defining what society should be doing or not doing. The second one are the ed schools. They're the ones that train the next generation of teachers, so they're hugely important. Then the unions, and not just the unions of teachers, but of service workers, of other professionals that are in the ecosystem of young people, of children, of education and related fields. Then we have the two last ones are the publishers and the media. Publishers because it could be the publisher of school textbooks that get distributed in mass numbers, but they can also be publishers like of newspapers, of media. So the media companies are a specific type of publisher that is focused on broadcasting, distribution, mass audiences that are critical for us as we get to more of the messaging stage. Mm-hmm. And all of these are the second stage of the Jiu-Jitsu strategy. And they are basically like there's six set of criteria that we use to assess whether or not the Jiu-Jitsu partners are Jiu-Jitsu partners. And there will be a link to that so you can have more information. But basically, there's a tendency for us to want all of our partners that we're already working with to qualify as Jiu-Jitsu because it's much easier. It's much more, it will be easier and more comfortable for us. But the truth is that we usually will have to go beyond the ones that we are currently working with and trying to reach these different categories of partners. So it's not an obvious, natural type of partner for us to work with, but they're the ones who are driving social demand for the everyone a changemaker world. We've been describing a lot all the work that Ashoka's been doing for 4 decades on venture and fellowship as, let's say, the very first CJ we ever had. And we managed to tip, so we had a paradigm shift. So it's a very good example of what happens when we're successful in doing that. But at the same time, there's a bit of difficulty sometimes in integrating, connecting, making sense of how all of that work connects with the newer CJs, like empathy and youth. So what do you think is the role of venture and fellowship in this connection with CJs and with framework change in general?
So we've always known that, or we have come to know that social entrepreneurs tend to be found in moments of history when fields are changing and new things are emerging, and social entrepreneurs are drawn to those tensions and help new fields and new ideas emerge out of moments of big change. And so venture's role is to continue to find those edges and fields where there is disruption and change, because that's where we'll find the social entrepreneurs, to continue to elect to find them, bring them into our network, and from there we will begin to see new patterns. And if fellowship is doing its work, fellowship is helping us spot those patterns, test collaborations and ideas to help the new CEJs emerge. And I'd say that the CEJs are movement building rather than field evolution. So the work that Next Now is doing, really focusing on specific fields, is something that needs to happen before we get to the next CEJs. We may find other CEJs that are not part of the Next Now work, but the Next Now is a bet on here are a couple of of fields, ideas that we see that are in a big shift at the moment, so where we will likely find social entrepreneurs. And with enough resources at scale, when we have an idea of where those big shifts are happening, if we have enough resources, we can begin to elect more fellows than we might otherwise spot, which will accelerate the contribution that Ashoka can make in helping that field emerge in a way that's for the good of all and for our CEJ movements to begin. Okay, Flavio, next question. What are some success stories of raising money to do the movement building work? What's the estimate of how much it would cost?
Well, first with the success stories, I think, because we have 4 stages, there's a different logic to each stage, and it requires, it entails different things. So there's a different kind of budget for each stage. So one thing we figured out is we need to plan and to budget and raise funds depending on the stage. So because stage 1 is you're building the community, you're bringing in co-leaders, there's a lot of relationship building, there's a lot of making sure that they're exposed to the community, to the Ashoka network that has a certain cost. Doing that with partners that are full partners that understand, want to build this community together, they want to, they see the power of that is the best thing. So in Brazil, we managed to have a partner that's a fellow that is also bringing in resources to build that first stage. So I think that's the kind of the best case scenario is when you can do that. Best thing is when you have a jiu-jitsu partner that is also supporting financially. But you can have that in every situation, like with governments and so on. So what we do is that the current jiu-jitsu we have help us raise funds, and the co-leaders, they help us raise funds with other partners when we go there together, when we pitch together, when we present together, because then we're showing the full power of what we can do together. Then when you get to open, which is 2B, there's a completely different value proposition, different cost mechanisms and so on, but we designed that together with the jiu-jitsu partners. And then messaging is very expensive, but the idea is we do it with media partners, with publishers, so it's also a different kind of cost system. And I think that how do we raise funds for this is we have to show the power of this community of co-leaders. We have to draw them in to connect them, and we have to show how it will change ultimately the decision-making process that will result in an ecosystem that is more of an everyone and changemaker ecosystem. It's very different from how we raise funds for venture and fellowship, for instance.
And a ballpark number for
all
4 stages?
For all 4 stages, well, we have just an idea. We have for the second level of stage 2, in Brazil, so of course you've got different currencies and so on, but it would cost around $500K US for a year for us to get the most out of stage 2 after we've built the community. But in the last 5 years, we've had an investment of maybe close to $600 US dollars a year, both in kind. There's a lot of in kind when you work with partners, and direct investment.
With a team of how many?
With a team
Staff.
With a team of in the beginning 1, and then 2 years ago 2.
Amazing.
What is the difference between system change and framework change?
So system change is our criteria for our fellows, always has been, always will be. We need our fellows to have a more than 50-75% chance. Every stage of the selection process, we believe they will achieve system change. That is breaking down the structures that have inhibited things to work in a particular way. It may be creating a new field, it may be creating new roles in society, it may be shifting market dynamics, public policy change. Framework change is mindset. It's helping people see differently so they can do differently. Which comes first? Ashoka believes that mindset shift, changing the way people see so that they can do differently, will affect many more people. So a more leveraged way to do change than system change. Mindset shift could come first to enable the system change work to happen much more quickly. It's another value of our fellows to have so many different kinds of system changes. What are the indicators for each type of jiu-jitsu partner?
I think in connection to your last answer as well, is because it's about framework change, we want to know to what extent they've helped shift the conversation. We want to know to what extent they are, for instance, engaging their constituents in a different way, because now they're engaging them on the grounds of the Everyone a Changemaker framework, and we want to know what has changed in the experience of people that are influenced by these big jiu-jitsu partners, right? So, for instance, when the government passes new legislation, like happened in São Paulo that we were connected to, when the São Paulo's Secretary of Education decided that every single municipal school should teach empathy, teamwork, and change making. That's just the beginning of the framework change, because what we asked next is, how does that impact on the technical teams from the secretaries in knowing how to roll out on this, because it's not easy? And then how does it impact on the school boards and the school principals? Will they know how to do that? And then the teachers will say, well, I'm not equipped to. I know the curriculum changed, I'm supposed to do it, but I'm not equipped. So what does it change in the ed schools? Do they need to train the next generations of teachers differently? And then the folks that are writing the textbooks have to think, well, I need to add this to the textbook because this is now a new requirement. So you see how one change in one class, just in the government class of Jiu-Jitsu partner, affects the whole value system and value chain of education. And it's the effect when people have to make a decision, because as you said, because framework change is about mindset, about perspective. It's like wearing a new pair of glasses. And now you have a new pair of glasses, so you're going to look at it differently, and you're going to make different sets of judgments, and you're going to require different things and demand different things. So I think we've succeeded when you have a parent going to a school, for instance, saying, hey, you were supposed to teach this, but you're not teaching it properly. Or I think my kid should have less of this and more of that, right? And based on this new framework. So the measures are in their constituents, but also in the broader movement. What effect do they have in shifting conversation, in engaging their constituents differently, and in helping everybody wear those pair of glasses, right? So they're basically the ones that help people wear those glasses, and we're the ones helping build the lenses with our co-leaders and partners.
Great.
Diana, you've worked a lot. You've created all the basis of the way that we measure the impact of fellows throughout the years, and now are designing this for framework change as well. So can you share like an example of where and when we have created framework change, and how do we measure that change and its success?
Well, I think the one place where we've begun to measure framework change is as we are rolling out the 4 drivers: Lead Young, Your Kids, Ashoka Young Changemakers, and peer-to-peer allies. Each of those are journeys that help people understand and experience framework change. And so we've done some testing in before and after scenarios around how people's thinking has moved. Framework change measures that we can look to for what we've done with social entrepreneurship include, when we started, there were no courses at university, much less degrees, much less centers. So we see new institutions emerging. We see university presidents recognize that it will attract more students if they have some aspect of social entrepreneurship or changemaker education on campus, because others have begun to see that helps students get jobs after university. We've seen publishing, the enormous array of books. We see the demand that social entrepreneurship has created for new kinds of philanthropy, and all of the philanthropic kinds of gifts and even co-investing emerge as a way to support social entrepreneurs or collective impact around groups of social entrepreneurs and other parts of society. With regard to the measures for framework change, we see 2 very clearly now. One being what percentage of any school or community or company employees are in fact change makers, and just now the impact team is developing a tool which is a self-assessment of change making based on the 4 abilities, and that is something that we will be able to share with any partner or any party who is interested in tracking, because for us what matters is when people begin to ask the question of what percentage of their own community is a change maker. So we'll have a tool for them to gauge that. The second measure that we now see applies is also to what extent is there a culture of change making in an institution. And we are just beginning now to think through a similar kind of tool to help partners or interested parties assess that. Mm-hmm. So success would be, as a parent is moving to a new place, they are asking the principal, is this a changemaker school?
Yes.
How can we measure success within the Jujitsu partnership type strategy?
Yes. Well, it's a journey, and it's all about framework changes, you were saying. So the measures are exactly the measures that you were describing. So, for instance, to know that the density of we could call changemaker awareness, right? So the concentration of how many people in their constituent groups recognize themselves as change makers. Mm-hmm. If you do that with a union, for instance, we would think about their membership. Mm-hmm. If you do that with a local unit, school unit, you would look at the school community in that district or in that region. And if you do that with publishers, it's amazing, because then you get this much more virtual but kind of massified group of people, and you can run, assessments with them. But there's also something about the measures of the Jiu-Jitsu partner work itself. So how do we know that we're progressing well? And Maria Laura here in the US came up with this understanding that there's 3 different levels at least of that engagement. Mm-hmm. First, they start basically adopting the new Everyone Changemaker framework. But for it not to be just about words and about actions, then we need to see if they engage their constituents that way. So by using the new language and the new narrative. And then, in doing that, they also give us access, or directly or indirectly, to their constituents. Because if they don't do that, then we don't have that power. And the third thing, which is the most exciting one, is when they start speaking publicly about this. So they decide that this is their most important a strategic source of success, is if they recognize that if they incorporate that narrative, and if that's part of the core of what they do, that's how they will be relevant in the future. That's how they will be more stronger, will better pursue their objectives. And they can do that internally, but until they've done that publicly, you don't actually start shifting the pieces. Because then you have the other ones, whether as a source of competition, healthy competition, or as a source of collaboration, they start shifting because the other ones have shifted. Mm-hmm. So like you described for social entrepreneurship, when you have one university doing this, and the other university is going to say, well, how come we don't have a social entrepreneurship summer course or whatever? And then they're going to create it. Mm-hmm. And then you have a writer that writes a book on that subject, receives massive attention, then the other one is going to want to change a little bit, but write another one. So it's the same thing with that. And so this moment where they go public is the most exciting one, because that's when we can achieve the most impact. Mm-hmm.
Great.
What are the more structural barriers that make it hard for everyone to truly be and act as a change maker?
So you mean, what are some of the system changes that have to happen on the way to framework change?
Exactly.
So I think we have to change the way young people grow up. That's the goal of CEJ 1 and 2. That the way in which the education system is currently set up in an old game model, when born out of the Industrial Revolution, when the game was repetitive function, and when the most important goal was reading and writing and math. And those are still critical skills. But what we're saying in CEJ 1 and 2 is that as urgent as those skills were for the growth of the Industrial Revolution, for an everyone a changemaker world, empathy is a critical skill. And that's what we need to ensure that young people have. And then that they're growing their muscle to be able to do change making. And if they start young and feel the power of making those changes as a teen, the next iteration and the next iteration will be all the more powerful. So specifically, we need to create space in schools and education systems for young people to master empathy. We already see our changemaker schools where that's baked in, and students are getting evaluated on that, and there are tools emerging. But we also need to create space where young people are spotting problems and have space and in their school day, not added on as an extra thing they do, but as part of the core work of being a student, to learn problem solving and being able to work in teams and see problems from multiple perspectives. How do you talk about the historic moment and the new inequality with Jiu-Jitsu partners, and what kind of reactions are you getting from them?
Yeah, so it's funny because when we started very early on and we talked about the historic opportunity, the reaction was a bit cynical sometimes. It was like, yeah, but the world has changed a lot before as well. I mean, talk about this to the folks during the French Revolution and see if they're not going to say that then the rate of change was much higher than now, whatever. So there's this first kind of reaction is that natural reaction of saying, well, I hadn't thought of it that way, so this causes a certain discomfort. And then basically you start asking about what has changed in the way that they work and the way that they do their job. And so when you see like that unions are reducing their members, have difficulty engaging them, when you see that society thinks that teachers don't have a social role, they're just download the content on your kids and that's your role and be quiet, So then the unions, for instance, realize that this moment is one where they have to think of a different social role for teachers that is in line with the historical moment. So that's when the conversation about the historical moment is less theoretical and more connected to their own experiences. So that worked well. And the one about the new inequality works when, especially with partners that are working with people that they want them to be change makers, but they are struggling because they come from, they're disenfranchised, they come from difficult backgrounds. And so, for instance, with the ed school that we work with in Brazil, they're the largest feeder ed school of the public schools afterwards. So these graduates all become public school teachers, and they're the first in their generation of their families that have a higher education degree. And so the issue there is, how do you talk about new inequalities so that they don't feel like the other inequalities don't still exist, but that the new one makes it even worse? So then this ed school, when they went public, the first time in those 3 stages that I was describing, when they got to go public, they framed the conversation around the new inequality. So they said, our teachers are now prepared, our future teachers, right, our students that we're training to be teachers, are now prepared to tackle the new inequality because they know the old one. They've lived the old one, in their skin, and now they are equipped to also deal with the new one. So when they go to deal with the kids from the public schools, they will know both worlds, and they will know how to address that. And that was amazing to see them doing it. And then in these kind of student guides that you have, like when you decide which ed school you're going to go to, they took the testimonial from graduates talking about, look, this helped me not just become a really good teacher, but know how to tackle the new inequality. So it's like, yes, bingo, that's exactly it. Because then you're dealing with the demand side of people choosing the ed school they're going to go to. That's framework change. It changes my decision, my choice. That leads us finally to the new game. So, and I want to ask you that with a bit of an anecdote, because we, it's normal in tipping moments that you get kind of the two forces, there's that moment of seeing what will which will be the dominant paradigm, in moments of transition. So we get a lot of people saying, for instance, well, it's beautiful, I see the sense of this, I see where you're going, but how come, you guys have produced this horrible president in country A, B, or C, or how come it's so difficult for children in a given country to have, support from their parents, right? So we get a lot of that, still indicators of the rest. And then when you say it's the big game, it sounds like it's not credible, because if it were the big game, then you should have, a better president, people should be voting, in a different way. So how do you describe what the big game is and breaking into that big game in the moment that we are currently, to show people more where we're headed and less that, this anxiety that we should have solved everything right now, right away?
I think of the big game as, the biggest possible impact for the least amount of effort. It goes to the jiu-jitsu strategy. And that we don't get caught up and distracted by doing the small things that will and small problems that will go away if we actually focus all of our energy on creating the big change. And, you know, any historical process is a reaction in part to what came before and or what is happening now. So I think the kinds of national narratives and the rise of nationalism is in part a reaction to the fluidity of what came before and the opportunity to be a more global society in dialogue where borders matter less. And now we see a whole narrative in reaction to that where borders need to matter more. And we see that with the narrative around migration in the US. We see it with Brexit in the UK and in other parts of the world as well. It's a reaction to what was another very different emergent possibility. And, you know, it depending on what we do and how we organize, it could be the last gasp of the old game. And we have seen so many people mobilized who weren't finding their agency or engaged in change as a result of both pieces. And it's up to us.
And in these moments of historical transition, the role of youth has always been critical. So it will be again, and it is again now, right?
Yes. Yes, unencumbered youth.